Welcome to the Maybe Not So Great Books channel, You Decide. This is lesson 9 of 14. Income Statistics Are Lying to You from Basic Economics. A Common Sense Guide to the Economy, 5th edition by Thomas Sowell. 75% of the Americans in the bottom 20% in 1975 were in the top 40% within 16 years. Were they still the poor? Okay, let's just stop right there because that statistic, when I first read it, it completely scrambled my brain. We hear these phrases all the time, right? The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. You're stuck in the class you're born into.
Yeah.
And then Sowell just comes in with this absolute sledgehammer of a number.
Right.
It suggests that the vast majority of people who were poor back in the 70s were actually, in the top half of earners not even 2 decades later. That sounds less like poverty and more like a phase you go through.
It completely challenges the standard narrative. And, the key to that statistic, what makes it so powerful is where it comes from. It's from a University of Michigan longitudinal study.
Longitudinal, okay, that word seems really important here.
It's everything. It's the whole ball game. Because most of the stats you see, the ones that get reported in the news or, that politicians use in speeches, they're snapshot statistics.
Right, like a picture.
Exactly. They take a picture of the economy in 1975 and they say, okay, who's in the bottom 20%? Then they take another picture in 1991 and say, okay, who's in the bottom 20% now? And they compare those two groups.
And the headline is usually something like, the bottom 20% has made no progress in 16 years.
Precisely. But the University of Michigan study didn't do that. They did something much more difficult, but much more revealing. They tracked the same specific human beings over those 16 years.
Ah, so they followed the people, not the category.
They followed the people, and what they found was this incredible, massive in 75. Well, they didn't stay there. They moved up and out. So asking if the bottom 20% is better off is like a meaningless question if the people in it have all left and been replaced by new people.
I love the way Sowell explains this. He uses this analogy of grades in a school. Can we walk through that? Because I feel like that visual just made everything click for me.
It's the perfect way to see the error.
Yeah.
So imagine you go to a local elementary school. You walk into the 3rd grade classroom.
Okay.
What's the average age in there? Maybe 8 years old, something like that.
9.
Right. Now you leave. You come back to that exact same school, that exact same classroom 10 years later. You walk in. What's the average age of the 3rd graders now?
Still 8.
Still 8. Exactly. Now, if you were just looking at the bracket called the 3rd grade, you'd have to conclude, my God, something is terribly wrong here. These children aren't aging. They've been stuck at age 8 for an entire decade. The system has failed.
Right, which is obviously absurd.
It's completely absurd because the 3rd grade is a category, It's not a fixed group of people. The actual kids who were in that room 10 years ago are now 18. They're graduating high school and they moved on. The category called 3rd grade is just constantly being refilled with new 8-year-olds.
And Sowell's argument is that income brackets are the exact same thing.
Right.
The bottom 20% is the 3rd grade. It's always going to be there by definition. It's always going to have a low income. But the actual people inside that bracket are constantly flowing through it and moving on.
That's it, precisely. And that is the absolute core mission of this deep dive today. We are going to unpack how these statistical categories hide the real story of individual economic mobility. We'll get into why household income is a statistical trap that confuses almost everyone, why income is not the same thing as wealth, and, why basically everything you think you know about inequality might be built on a foundation of, well, a statistical illusion.
It honestly feels like we're about to pull back the curtain on a magic trick that's been fooling everyone for decades. So let's start with this first big idea, the musical chairs of income brackets.
Right.
You mentioned the snapshot versus the motion picture. The outline has this piece of IRS data that is just, I had to read it 3 times. It sounds completely backwards. So between 1996 and 2005, the income of the actual individuals who started in the bottom 20%, it increased by 91%.
Correct. A 91% increase for the people who started at the bottom.
Okay, but at the same time, the income of the people who started in the top 1%, it fell by 26%.
Yes.
How is that even possible? I mean, seriously.
Yeah.
You open any newspaper, you go on any news site, and the story is billionaire wealth explodes and wages are stagnant for the poor. How can the IRS data show the poor nearly doubling their income while the rich lose a quarter of theirs?
Because the newspaper is talking about the brackets, the IRS data is talking about the people. The motion picture, not the snapshot. Let's just break it down. Who is in that bottom 20% bracket in any given year?
Well, the image we have is, the poor.
Mm.
People struggling, maybe working minimum wage, long-term unemployment.
And some of those people are in there for sure, but a huge, huge portion of that bracket are simply young people.
Young.
Yeah. A person who is 22 years old, they
Right.
just got their college degree, they're in their first job, maybe it's an internship, or they're working part-time at a coffee shop while they're finishing their master's. Their income is, by definition, very low.
Okay, that makes sense.
But they have what economists call high human capital. They have skills, education, energy, their whole career ahead of them. Now, fast forward 9 years, from 1996 to 2005. What happens to that 22-year-old?
They get a real job, they get a promotion, maybe 2 or 3 promotions. They switch companies for a big raise.
Exactly. They gain skills, they gain experience, they become way more valuable to an employer, so their income just skyrockets. That 91% increase isn't a story of, some magical poverty program. It's largely just the natural, predictable life cycle of a career. They're moving from the economic third grade to the fourth grade, fifth grade, and beyond.
Okay, I get that for the bottom, they're rising. That's intuitive. But the top 1% falling by 26%.
Yeah.
That still feels wrong. Why would their income drop?
This is where it gets really, really fascinating. Because the top 1%, that bracket, is even more like a hotel than a permanent residence. People don't usually stay there for decades and decades.
So isn't it?
Often, people spike into the top 1% because of a one-time windfall event. Think about it. Maybe you're a small business owner. You've spent 30 years building your company. In 2001, you sell it. For that 1 year, your income is massive. You're in the top 1%.
Right, for that 1 year.
Exactly. But what's your income the next year? You aren't selling the business again. You're just retired. Or maybe you've taken some of that money and you're starting a new small venture that isn't profitable yet. Your income plummets.
It was a one-time peak.
A one-time peak. Or think of a different example. A corporate executive, a surgeon, a top lawyer. They're, say, 58 years old in 1996. They are absolutely at their peak earning years. They're in the top 1%. Now, what happens to them over the next 9 years?
They retire.
They retire. And the moment you retire, what happens to your income, your salary, your wage?
It goes to zero.
It drops off a cliff. You might be incredibly wealthy. You might have millions in assets in your 401k in your home, but your income, as defined by the IRS for that year, has collapsed.
Yeah.
So the data tracks that person falling out of the top bracket.
So the person who's poor in 1996 is now a 31-year-old manager making good money. And the person who was rich in 1996 is now a 67-year-old retiree playing golf.
You've got it. That's the churn. And if you only look at the brackets, you miss all of that incredible emotion. You just see a high number and a low number, and you assume it's the same people, stuck. You don't see that they've been trading places.
This flows so perfectly into the next section, this idea of the life cycle of earnings. On a personal level, this just clicks. I definitely earn more now than when I was an intern. A lot more.
And you'll probably earn more in 10 years than you do now, and that's normal. Most people follow a predictable arc. Their earnings are low when they're young, they rise through their 30s and 40s, and they hit their peak earning years in their late 40s and 50s.
Right.
And this is where Sowell makes a really provocative, almost radical point. He says a huge amount of what we call income inequality is really just age inequality.
Age inequality, what does that even mean?
Okay, imagine a perfectly egalitarian society. Absolutely everyone has the exact same career path, earns the exact same lifetime income. Everyone starts at, say, $30,000 when they're 20. At 30, they get a raise to $60,000. At 50, they're making $100,000, and then they retire.
Okay. A very fair, predictable world. No structural barriers.
In a life cycle sense, yes, everyone gets the exact same deal over their life. But now, let's take a statistical snapshot of that society on one random Tuesday. What do you see?
You see a bunch of 20-year-olds making $30,000 and a bunch of 50-year-olds making $100,000.
And what would the headline be? The top earners make over 3 times more than the bottom earners. Society is rife with inequality. You would scream about the massive gap, but in reality, you're not measuring unfairness. You're just measuring the difference between a 50-year-old and a 20-year-old. The difference between a father and his son who will one day be in his father's shoes.
That's a really powerful way to think about it. If you just throw everyone into the same statistical bucket, young, old, mid-career, of course you're going to see huge gaps just based on age and experience alone.
Of course. And Mike Sowell adds another layer to this. He points out that in our modern knowledge-based economy, that gap between the young and the experienced is naturally wider than it used to be.
So.
Well, think about an economy based on physical labor. Digging ditches, for example. A 20-year-old is probably just as productive, maybe even more productive than a 50-year-old. Physical strength peaks early.
Sure, you don't need 30 years of ditch-digging experience to be good at it.
Exactly. But in a knowledge economy, a surgeon with 30 years of experience is vastly more skilled and can handle far more complex cases than a first-year resident. A senior software architect can solve problems a junior coder can't even comprehend. So that experience premium, the extra money you get for being older and wiser, it gets bigger and bigger.
Which makes the snapshot inequality look even worse, even if nothing unfair is happening.
Correct. It's just a reflection of where value comes from in our economy.
You mentioned that medical resident. This brings up another one of Sowell's categories, what he calls the transient poor.
Yes, and this is a crucial distinction to make. There is a world of difference between someone who is genuinely, chronically poor, someone trapped in a cycle of poverty, and someone who is just statistically poor for a short time.
Like the law student who is taking on debt and has zero income.
Exactly. That law student, or the medical resident working 80 hours a week for a stipend, they show up in the government statistics as being in the absolute bottom bracket. They are, on paper, the poor.
But they are about to become some of an economy's highest earners in just a few years.
Right, and including them in the same category as a single mother struggling to feed her kids on a minimum wage job. It completely distorts our understanding of what poverty actually is in this country.
And it messes up policy, I'd imagine.
Tremendously. If you design a welfare program to help the bottom 20%, you might just end up subsidizing the living expenses of a future corporate lawyer. You're giving money to someone who is on the launch pad about to take off instead of focusing those resources on the people who are truly stuck on the ground.
It all comes back to that one question, doesn't it? When you see a statistic, you have to ask, who are we actually talking about here?
That's the question Sowell wants us to ask every single time. And it gets even more complicated. The statistical illusion gets even thicker when we stop talking about individuals and start talking about households.
Ah, yes. Household income.
Yeah.
This is the big one. This is the metric we hear constantly. Median household income is up or median household income is down. It's the go-to number for the health of the middle class.
It is, and Sowell argues it is perhaps the single most misleading, most misused statistic in all of economics. He calls comparing the incomes of different household brackets, comparing apples to watermelons.
Apples to watermelons, I'm guessing because of the size difference?
Exactly. We hear the word household and we unconsciously picture a standard unit, a nuclear family. But in the real world, households are all different sizes. And this is the critical part. The average size of a household is systematically different depending on which income bracket you're looking at.
Okay, so give me the data on this. How big is the difference we're talking about?
The data Sowell cites from 2002 is just stunning. In that year, the bottom 20% of households in America contained about 40 million people.
Okay, 40 million people in the bottom quintile. Got it.
But the top 20% of households, the top quintile, contained about 69 million people.
Whoa, hang on. Pause on that. How can the top 20% have 29 million more people in it than the bottom 20%? That doesn't make any mathematical sense. 20% is 20%.
It sounds impossible, right? But it's because we're counting households, not people. A household is just an address. It's a front door.
Okay.
Behind one of those front doors, in the bottom bracket, you might have a single 80-year-old widow living on Social Security. That is one household. Behind another front door, in the top bracket, you might have a husband and wife who are both working professionals, plus a 25-year-old son who just moved back home and also has a job. That is also one household.
So the bottom bracket is just full of smaller households.
Overwhelmingly. The bottom bracket is disproportionately made up of single-person households. The elderly living alone, young people who haven't married yet, single parents. The top bracket is disproportionately made up of married couple families, often with multiple people earning an income.
So when we read a headline that says the top 20% of households earns, say, 10 times more than the bottom 20%.
We're not just comparing rich versus poor. We are literally comparing the combined income of a household with 2 or 3 working adults to the income of a household with 1 retired person.
It's like comparing the revenue of a whole company to the salary of one of its employees.
It's comparing an army to a squad. And of course, the army's going to have more firepower. I mean, Sowell points out something that sounds comically obvious, but it gets lost in the debate. There is a very, very strong correlation between working and earning income.
You don't say.
I know, shocking. But the data is stark. The top 5% of households in America have more heads of household working full-time, year-round, than the entire bottom 20% of households combined.
Say that again. That's a wild statistic.
Let it sink in. There are more people working full-time in that tiny sliver at the very top, the 5%, than there are in the whole bottom 20%, because that bottom bracket is largely composed of people who aren't in the workforce full-time. Retirees, students, people who are unemployed, people who work part-time. So again, what are we measuring when we talk about income inequality? Is it systemic unfairness? Or is it largely just measuring the fact that some households have way more work hours going into them than others?
That reframes the entire picture. If you have two teachers married to each other, their household income could easily put them in a high bracket, even though individually they aren't rich.
Exactly. Their household might make more than a single high-powered lawyer. So the household data makes the teachers look richer than the lawyer, which is just not right.
This connects directly to another huge point Sowell makes, which is this shrinking household phenomena. This feels like the key to unlocking the whole middle-class stagnation narrative we hear so much about.
This is one of the most persistent economic myths out there, and it's almost entirely a statistical artifact. The simple fact is, over the last 50 or 60 years, the average American household has gotten a lot smaller.
People getting divorced, marrying later, having fewer kids.
All of it. Seniors living longer and on their own instead of with their kids. In 1960, you might have had 3 generations and their incomes under one roof. Today, that's 3 separate households, each with a smaller income.
Okay, so how does that single change screw up the statistics so badly?
Well, look at the numbers Sowell uses for the period between 1969 and 1996. Over those, roughly 30 years, real median household income rose by only 6%.
6%. That's basically nothing. That is stagnation. That's the story we always hear.
It is. It sounds like the American dream is dead. It's the perfect data point if you want to argue that the economy is failing the middle class.
But there's a but.
There's a huge but. Over that exact same period, from 1969 to 1996, real per capita income, that's income per person, rose by 51%.
Wait, 6% versus 51%?
Yeah.
That's not a small difference. That's the difference between two completely different universes.
It's the difference between stagnation and widespread prosperity. And the reason for the gap is simple math. The country's total income pie was getting much, much bigger, but we were slicing it up among more and more households as people spread out and lived in smaller groups.
Okay, let me try a simple analogy to make sure I've got this. Let's say in 1970, you have one household, a married couple, and they make a combined $100,000.
Okay.
By 2000, they've gotten a divorce. Now they're 2 separate households. And because they've gotten raises over the years, they each make $75,000.
Right.
So if you look at household income, it went from one household making $100,000 to an average household income of $75,000. It looks like it crashed by 25%.
It looks like a disaster. The household got poorer.
But the per-person income went from $50,000 each to $75,000 each. The individuals got much, much richer.
You've nailed it. That's the illusion. And that's why you have to be so careful about which statistic is being used. A politician who wants to say the economy is failing will always, always cite household income. A politician who wants to say things are getting better will cite per capita income. Sowell's point is that the per capita number is the one that actually tells you how individual human beings are doing.
I honestly feel like I need to go back and fact-check every news article I've ever read about the economy. It's just incredible how you can use true numbers to paint a picture that is the complete opposite of reality.
It's a masterclass in how to lie with statistics. And that art form is taken to its highest level when we start talking about the very, very top of the ladder.
The famous top 1%, the billionaires. This takes us to the next big theme, the difference between wealth and income.
Right. And again, it starts with the basic problem of terminology. Most people, in everyday conversation, use income and wealth as if they mean the same thing.
Yeah, I would say I do. If you have a high income, you're wealthy. If you're wealthy, you must have a high income. They feel like synonyms.
But in economics, they are two completely different things. Income is a stream. It's a flow. It's the money that comes into your bank account this year. Wealth is a reservoir. It's a stock. It's what you have accumulated and managed to keep over many years.
A stream versus a reservoir. Okay, I like that.
The implications are massive. You can have an incredibly high income and have zero wealth if you spend every dollar you make. Think of the stories of pro athletes or lottery winners who end up bankrupt.
High stream, leaky reservoir.
Perfect analogy. And conversely, you can have enormous wealth, but very low income. We already talked about the retiree. Or think of a farmer. He might own 1,000 acres of land worth millions of dollars. That's his wealth. But if there's a drought one year, his taxable income might be zero.
Right.
But Sowell uses this distinction to go after an even bigger idea, this myth of a permanent entrenched class of the super rich.
The idea that the 1% is like a modern aristocracy. Once you're in, you and your kids and their kids are set for life.
Exactly. And to test this idea, Sowell turns to a fantastic source, the Forbes 400 list, the list of the 400 wealthiest people in America. Now, if the rich just get richer and class is permanent, that list should be pretty stable over time, right? The same family name should dominate it, decade after decade.
The Rockefellers, the Mellons, the DuPonts, the old money.
Precisely. So let's look at the data. In 1982, when the list first came out, it included 14 Rockefellers,
14. Okay, that sounds like a dynasty to me.
and it included 28 DuPonts.
Wow. Okay, so that's 42 people, more than 10% of the entire list from just two families. That definitely seems to support the old money runs everything theory.
It does. It looks like a fixed aristocracy. But then let's fast forward just 20 years to 2000. How many Rockefellers are left on the list?
I'm going to guess maybe 7, half of them?
3.
3, down from 14 to 3.
And the DuPonts?
Oh no, 0,
0. Not a single one.
not 1.
What happened? I mean, where did all that money go? Well, part of it is that as families have more children, the fortune gets diluted with each generation. But the main story is that they were simply overtaken. They were pushed off the list by new money, by people like Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos and the Walton family. The economy, as the economist Joseph Schumpeter said, runs on creative destruction. New industries, new technologies, new ideas rise up and displace the old ones.
It's that churn again, the turnover we don't see.
And here is the single most incredible statistic on this. It's about inheritance. In 1982, 21% of the wealth on the Forbes 400 list had been inherited.
Okay, so about 1 in 5 fortunes was old money.
Right. By 2006, that number had fallen to just 2%.
2, from 21 to 2. That is a staggering collapse. It means that by the mid-2000s, basically everyone on that list was self-made.
Or it had taken a much smaller inheritance and grown it massively. It just completely demolishes the idea of a closed, static caste of the rich. The rich is a revolving door. The people at the top are constantly being challenged and replaced by hungry, innovative new people climbing the ladder.
So let me see if I can sum this up. The slogan, "The rich get richer," might be technically true for the bracket itself. Like, the price of admission to the top 1% club keeps going up.
Yes, the threshold rises.
But the actual people inside that bracket are constantly getting kicked out and replaced.
That is a perfect summary. The bracket is a fancy hotel suite. The price per night keeps going up, but the guests are different every year. And we keep analyzing the suite as if the same person has been living in it for 50 years.
The hotel economy. I like that. You check in for your peak earning years, you have a great run, and then you check out into retirement.
And someone else takes your room.
Okay, this brings us to the big so what question.
Yeah.
We've gone through the data, we've seen how the stats can be an illusion. The brackets are musical chairs, households are a trap, the rich are a revolving door. But why does this actually matter for policy and for our lives today?
It changes absolutely everything about how we should think about public policy. Let's start with taxes.
Okay, tax the rich. It's one of the most popular political slogans out there.
Of course it is. But who are you actually taxing? If the rich are mostly middle-class people who are just having one spectacular high-income year, the year they sell the business they built for 40 years, the year they cash out their life savings for retirement, then a huge punitive tax on the rich isn't hitting a permanent aristocracy.
You're hitting a normal person's nest egg.
You are taxing a middle-class person's life savings at the exact moment they try to harvest it. You think you're taxing a Rockefeller, but you're actually taxing the plumber from down the street who finally sold his business to retire.
And what about the other end of the spectrum? Helping the poor.
Same problem. If your poverty statistics are filled with medical students, law students, and 23-year-olds in their first job, then these broad, one-size-fits-all anti-poverty programs are just spraying money everywhere. You're subsidizing people who are on a temporary layover in the bottom bracket before they take off to the top bracket.
You're wasting resources that could be going to the people who are actually truly stuck.
Exactly. And this feels like the most important nuance in this whole discussion. Sowell is not saying that poverty doesn't exist. He's not that naive.
No, of course not. There are people who absolutely do not move out of that bottom bracket their entire lives.
Exactly. And this is the necessary debate angle we have to acknowledge. Sowell is a brilliant empiricist. He's proving that the statistics as they are commonly used are fundamentally misleading. But that doesn't mean real hardship doesn't exist.
Right. So you can believe Sowell's analysis of the data and still believe that we have a problem with, say, intergenerational poverty for certain communities.
You can. And in fact, some newer research from economists like Raj Chetty suggests that while mobility is real, it may have slowed down in recent decades compared to the period Sowell is often analyzing. The rungs on the ladder might be getting further apart.
So the truth is somewhere in the middle.
It often is. Sowell's main contribution here is to show that we vastly, dramatically underestimate the amount of mobility that already exists because we use bad data. But that doesn't mean we should swing to the other extreme and pretend that everyone automatically succeeds just by getting older. Some people are trapped.
But his point would be that unless you can statistically separate the transient poor from the chronically poor, your policies are guaranteed to be inefficient and ineffective.
You've got it. If you treat the law student and the single mother who has been unemployed for 3 years as the same data point, you will fail to help the person who actually needs it. You have to get the diagnosis right before you can write the prescription.
There's one last piece from the outline I really want to cover because it's maybe the most, I don't know, uncomfortable part of this chapter. It's about work, the simple role of effort.
Yes. This is where Sowell is at his most blunt, his most direct. He argues that very often, large differences in income simply reflect large differences in the amount and type of work being performed.
He has that great quote, "There is no collective decision by society as to how much each individual's work is worth."
Right. There's this pervasive idea that income is distributed. Like there's a giant pie in the sky, and some central committee decides to give a big slice to CEOs and a tiny sliver to teachers.
As if someone is dealing cards from a deck and giving some people all the aces.
But that's not how an economy works. Money isn't distributed. It's earned through billions of voluntary transactions every day. And Sowell says, before you scream about unfairness, just look at the inputs. Look at the data on hours worked. It's not a small difference, it's a chasm.
We talked about it with households. The top-earning households just have way more people working and working more hours.
Exactly. So you can't expect a household where two people are working combined 90 hours a week to have the same income as a household where no one is working full-time. It's a mathematical impossibility.
So his point is that unequal outcomes are often the direct result of unequal inputs.
Unequal inputs of hours, of skills, of experience, of risk-taking. Sowell's argument isn't that the world is perfectly fair. It's that our first instinct when we see an income gap shouldn't be to assume it's because of discrimination or systemic unfairness. Our first instinct should be to ask, are we comparing like with like? Or are we comparing someone working 60 hours a week in a high-demand field with someone working 10 hours a week in a low-demand field?
It's that stage one thinking problem he talks about in the rest of the book. Looking at the result without ever investigating the process that created it.
That's it. If one person lifts weights for 2 hours every day and another person watches TV, and after a year one of them is much stronger, we don't call that strength inequality and demand that their muscles be redistributed. We understand it's a direct result of different inputs. Sowell is just asking us to apply that same basic logic to economics.
Okay, let's try to pull this all together. It's a lot of mind-bending data. But Lesson 9 really feels like it's a lesson in critical thinking and skepticism.
It is. It's a lesson in not automatically trusting the headline number you're given.
So the big takeaways for me. First, don't confuse the brackets with the people. The statistical categories are static, but the people inside them are constantly moving.
The musical chairs effect. The third grade is always full of 8-year-olds, but the actual children grow up and move on.
Second, watch out for the household trap. Households are getting smaller, which makes income look flat even when individual people are getting much richer. And richer households are often just bigger households with more workers.
The apples and watermelons problem. If you don't adjust for the number of people and the number of workers in a household, the data is meaningless.
And third, remember the life cycle. A lot of what we call poverty is just youth, and a lot of what we call being rich is just being middle-aged and at your career peak.
Which connects directly to the wealth versus income point. Even the super rich, as the Forbes 400 shows, are subject to the constant, relentless churn of the market. The economy is a motion picture, not a photograph.
And the danger, as you said, is that we see these misleading photographs, we react emotionally, and we demand policies that are based on a complete misunderstanding of the problem.
That is the core danger of stage 1 thinking. If your diagnosis is wrong, your prescription will be wrong. And in economics, the wrong prescription, bad tax policy, misdirected welfare programs can do incredible harm. It can slow down the very mobility it's trying to create.
So here's a final provocative thought to leave you with. The next time you see a headline about income inequality, the gap between rich and poor widens, or the middle class vanishes, just pause and ask yourself this one question. Are they talking about a permanent class of people who are trapped? Or are they describing a temporary stage of life that most people pass through? Are you looking at a prison, or are you looking at a hallway?
That is the essential question. Because if it's a hallway, the goal isn't to tear down the walls, it's to make sure the doors at both ends stay open and to help anyone who gets stuck along the way.
That was lesson 9 of 14 on basic economics. A common sense guide to the economy, 5th edition. Subscribe for the full series. If you haven't seen our debate overview of the whole book, check that out, link in the description. Thanks for being here. See you next time.